Motherhood is where it all begins. It is our literal origin story, and as a therapist, I knew we could do a better job supporting new moms. Come with me on this journey as we build the digital village, one family at a time. So many women are traumatized by their birth experience. Join me in this episode when I talk with Kayleigh Summers, known as the Birth Trauma Mama on Instagram and TikTok. We're both therapists who also love working with traumatic birth and helping people heal. Listen to why this is happening, what we think we can do about it, and just a lot of good sisterhood fun. Hope you enjoy. Well, welcome, Kayleigh. I'm really glad you're here.
Thanks so much for having me, Krysta. I'm super excited.
Yeah, this is really fun that we get to talk about this because I know this is a topic that is really near and dear to both of us.
Yes.
Something that we are both really passionate about. And I'm so excited in the time period of like working around the topic of birth trauma to see how much enthusiasm and how much interest it's getting in the mental health spaces is like incredible.
Finally, we're getting there.
We're getting there. And I didn't expect to start here, but I'm just going to say, I feel like that some of that is really credited to people like yourself who have made an effort to educate on the subject in social media, like where people are, right? It's like we've been having this conversation in academic spaces, at least from my perspective, working in this, like academically, we've talked about it for a while, but that's not the same thing as, like the families getting to hear about it and feel supported.
Yeah, first of all, that's much too big of a compliment. I appreciate and accept it, but I think there's a lot to be said just about the timing, right? 2019, 2020, it was just like things blew up online.
Right.
I don't necessarily think I set out to like light the world on fire about birth trauma.
Right.
But I'm grateful to have gotten like that opportunity, which I much more feel like it is rather than anything that I specifically spun in the social media world. But yeah.
Okay, well, I'm going to give you some credit though.
Okay, thank you. I accept.
It's totally, to me, it's like completely surreal because I feel like, I think I shared this with you before, but I feel like I spent literally about a decade, even in speaking in conferences, using the phrase birth trauma and spending the good first few slides just telling people what it was. Because some would nod and be like, I know what you're talking about. And other people would be like, well, I mean, in their defense, to their credit, if you're a medical person, trauma, usually means like medical, physical trauma, meaning like damage to your body. So they were just really confused about moving to psychological trauma as a concept. And like, I had to do all of this sort of background to just begin to even talk about it. And now I'm like amazed. It's so cool to just see people having conversation about it openly. Families getting referred for care in their postpartum visit immediately after. Like, I'm really encouraged about just the awareness being given to it. But I'd like to rewind and start with, for those who maybe haven't heard of you and your work or know your story, would you give an overview of like why you care so much about this and how you got here?
Yeah, I will give you the very short version. So I, in 2019, was pregnant with my first and only child, my son Callahan, and I went into birth like prepared. I was like, I know this is going to be the hardest thing I've ever done. It is going to be incredibly difficult, but also wonderful, beautiful, and joyful. And that is not what happened. So I had a really rare obstetric complication that is often fatal called an amniotic fluid embolism. And so I went from being super healthy to being in cardiac arrest in the middle of my labor. And it was devastating, terrifying, all of the things that you can imagine that experience would be. And I was very lucky to have a really supportive medical team who knew what they were doing and saved our lives. And I always say a lot of luck sprinkled in as well.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I came out of that, like I think that's like the meat of the story, right? Like you should have died and you survived, and oh my gosh, and that's really what everyone focuses on. And I get why. I am really proud of that part of my story, like surviving that, having all of those things in place, getting out of the ICU in 2 weeks.
I mean, quite literally fighting for your life.
Yes, yes.
Mm.
And my family did an incredible job documenting it for me. So there are all these really like interesting pieces that feel actually okay at this point. Like that
Mm.
story of survival feels okay.
Mhm.
Um, and I kind of thought it would end there when I was discharged from the ICU and went home after lots and lots of interventions and lots of life saving. I was able to go home, and I remember I have a text to my best friend that said, I can't believe I get to just like live. Like, who gets to go through this and just like go
Wow.
home and go back and live their life?
Right.
And so that was a perfect description of how I felt at the time. Like, we were just
Mhm.
going to sail off into the sunset. I had nurses and doctors
The
coming in.
yeah, sure, like the hard part's behind you, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. And that's when I was really kicked in the face with the fact that it had actually just begun.
Mm.
And I was really confused by that. And this is the part that I always talk about as a therapist who's experienced their own birth trauma is this is the exact moment where I didn't get it. Like if I had understood what birth trauma was, if I had known
Mm.
what perinatal trauma was before my birth experience, it would not have saved me from being traumatized. That is not the point, in my opinion, of why I share
Mhm.
and why we build awareness. But it's for
Mhm.
this moment right here where you feel so out of sorts and you're not depressed
Mhm.
and you're not anxious, but you can't stop thinking about your experience. You feel like a terrible mom because you really want nothing to do with your baby for some people, including myself. And you're sitting there thinking, but all I wanted was to survive, right? The end goal was healthy mom and healthy baby, right? So
Right.
why do I
We're
feel
walking out here, so
awful?
it should be
Yeah,
like walk into the sunset, go start our lives,
yeah.
pick up where I left off. I came in healthy and excited to meet my baby, and I should walk out the doors healthy and excited to meet
Yes.
my baby. Yeah.
Yes. And so why do I feel so awful?
Yeah.
And I couldn't figure it out for a little bit there.
Isn't that
And
amazing?
even yeah, even when I went to therapy, even when I had all of the validation, I just kept thinking like, why can't I handle this?
Mhm.
And I realized that I was not the only one that felt this way. And I soon realized how pervasive birth trauma was, not just in a physical sense, a complication sense, a near death experience sense, but in a psychological sense as
That's right.
well.
Yeah. Yeah. And this is a good place to put in there if you're somebody who's listening to this and you're like, oh, I relate, or oh, how common is this issue? Really, we know that about 8% of women who give birth will have PTSD as a result of their birth that did not have it going in.
Yep.
8%, that's not an insignificant number. And
No.
PTSD is really impactful,
Yep.
right? I mean, PTSD is just it overshadows everything else when it's
Yeah.
not something you can put off to the side and just not experience and not think about today,
No,
you
it's
know?
not a choice. It's not a
Yeah,
choice to
it's not
just
a
kind of put it
choice.
down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But we also know that, depending upon the research, like more than 30%, so about 1 in 3, have trauma symptoms that are significant enough that it's like impacting their life. They may not check every box for PTSD, but they are feeling, intrusive thoughts or flashbacks or hypervigilance to some degree that it's impacting their relationships, their ability to sleep, their ability to go to postpartum care, or, their ability to bond with baby or whatever it is for them. And so, like, I think to your point, it's so amazing that you were a student at the time that this happened, right? You were a mental
No,
health,
I was a full blown, I was
you
a
were
full blown therapist.
you were a
Yep.
full-blown therapist. So like
Yeah.
the fact that we're in mental health
Yep.
and don't know, well then like who has a shot at knowing?
Exactly my point. Yes, this is what I
Right?
always say. Like, I'm
Yeah.
literally, I did not work in perinatal mental health, but still, like,
Mhm.
trauma
Mhm.
is
Mhm.
trauma, but we are always, right? We are kind of educated to believe, even as therapists, that trauma looks a very specific way.
Mhm.
And going through childbirth is hard. It's difficult. And sure, I got the short end of the stick, but why can't I just get over it because we're
Yeah.
alive and for all intents and purposes, we shouldn't be.
Yeah, that's where the really bad advice of like just be grateful,
Yes.
as if that will erase PTSD. Just be grateful.
Yes.
Did you ever
Yes.
feel, I've never asked you this before, so I'm not sure if this question is going to make sense, but did you ever feel like there was some part of invalidating your trauma symptoms because you were unconscious for a lot of the worst of it?
Yes. Oh my God, yes.
Yeah.
I,
It was.
yeah. I was
Because I
like,
know your story pretty well at this point. So I
uh-huh.
know that a lot of the worst parts, you were not conscious because you were being supported by a team and by machinery, and like you were not consciously aware. So I wonder if people ever were like, well, I mean, what would you be traumatized by?
Yeah, I think I did it more to myself, I would
Mm.
say, than people did it to me. And I think that came up a lot between my husband and I, where
Because he was
he
aware during
was
those
there.
worst
Yes,
parts.
yes,
Yeah.
yes, yes. He saw the cardiac arrest, he saw the CPR, all of that. And so him and my family were a part of some of the worst parts, and I was not. I am a clinician who believes, of course, that my body was there and it
Yes.
does hold on to that trauma and
Yeah.
remember. But back then, I don't know that I really thought that and felt that. And so, yeah,
Hmm.
I did invalidate a lot. I think this brings up an important point too, something that I have found clinically. And this is speaking, of course, from my own experience is that I was, of course, invalidated with the like, at least you guys are healthy, at least you survived,
Hmm.
all of that,
Hmm.
right? And I also had a lot of validation because I was on the
Mm.
highest form of life support. When I tell people I was on ECMO, they're like, oh shit. Like
Yeah.
you were bad,
Yeah.
bad. You got a
Yeah.
perimortem C-section. Like, so there's a part of it that people are like, okay, like I kind of get why you're traumatized. Like
Sure.
that's a terrible way to give birth. Like I had medical professionals crying. Like that is
Right.
validation.
Yeah, they probably experienced trauma from your birth as well. Yeah.
They did.
Yeah.
And that is a much different experience than someone who was treated poorly, than
Yes.
someone who was traumatized in what I view, and I'm not comparing, it's just different, but in a like a bit more insidious way.
Mhm.
Because everyone will just be like, what? That's just birth. Like
Mhm.
you didn't almost die, you didn't this, you didn't that. And that person has already said all of those things to themselves.
That's right. Yes, it's they didn't need to hear that from you.
Yes. And so
Have you
now
tried
they're
looking on the
telling,
bright side?
ugh, yeah.
Have you
And
tried
I
just not
just,
thinking about it?
right. And I
Yeah,
just find that that is, it feels, I got the validation part. And a lot of
that's
people with, I
amazing.
think, maternal near
Yeah.
misses get a lot of that validation. Whereas when we're looking at actually the birth trauma that I see more happen more often, I'm not sure about you,
Yeah.
but what I see come across my office more often is that mistreatment, that
Mhm.
obstetric violence, that,
Mhm.
and even sometimes not at the fault of a medical team, but just a patient having no idea what's going on, which actually kind of is the fault of the medical team, but
Mhm. Mhm.
goes into a whole nother. But just this feeling of being out of control, this
Right.
feeling of not knowing what's happening to their body,
Yeah.
all of those things can cause trauma, and that's why trauma is so incredibly subjective.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you brought that up because somebody might be listening to us and they're like, I'm experiencing trauma symptoms and but like listen to her story. Like I have nothing to be upset about. And they're maybe even invalidating their own experience as they're listening to us. So if that's you and you're listening to us, please know that it is valid and that, one of the things that I think is so important is that I see these this branch, sort of two options for how we get to birth trauma. One is sort of classic PTSD. Your life or your baby's life was in danger. It was scary. There's terror. And it's a very classic PTSD, similar to what somebody might have in combat or somebody might have in a really bad car accident, where it's like we're scared for survival and it stays with us, right? And that is a classic PTSD route. But there's this other branch that I agree, I see more of this just by numbers because not everybody has the harrowing story. Um, and this is why I think we get up to like over 30% is the fact that there's this other branch of people, what I call preventable PTSD, where it's related to other aspects of their care,
Yeah.
feeling neglected, feeling coerced, feeling misled. Um, and what's tricky, and I like that word insidious, is like that kind of trauma, you can so gaslight yourself.
Oh,
And part
yes.
of where I got passionate about educating therapists on this was because I just kept having people come in my office and say, I went to a therapist. They diagnosed me with postpartum depression or anxiety, like they missed the trauma,
Yes.
right? And then they tried to just basically tell me to be grateful that we're all okay and birth is hard. And, it's so weird because as therapists, we don't do that about other stuff,
Nope.
right? Like if somebody comes to us and says, I was regularly abused by my caregivers growing up, we don't go, well, just be grateful they fed you and be grateful
Hmm.
you survived and try thinking on the bright side.
Yep.
Right? We go like that is valid and that is real and what is you're feeling is true in your body and it needs to be processed and it deserves to be given healing and care and it's like very clear. But when it's in medical care for some reason, we have this blind spot where it's like, well, they were trying their best to help you and it just didn't go well and that sucks and we're done. And
Yep.
so
You survived.
you survived and it's the same gaslighting, right? So I think it's so good to just say to those people who are hearing us right now, actually, interestingly enough, if you take the bulk of that 30+% of people and you kind of like create the picture of the
Yep.
average woman with trauma from her birth um, had a medically normal vaginal birth with low analgesic use,
Yep.
who experienced high levels of pain and felt out of control.
Yep.
That is the average picture of the person in that category. And I think that's so important to say because it's so different from the picture that we get.
So different. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah. This kind of idea that like only low intervention birth is going to be, non-traumatic. That's not
Mm.
true either.
No, it is not.
No.
I always like to say, unfortunately, trauma happens in all environments with all
In all
providers.
settings. Yep. It can happen in a home setting. It can happen
Yep.
in a birth center. It can happen in a hospital. Um, I'm a certified doula. I've attended like healing second cesareans, like elective
Yeah.
cesareans.
Yes, I could talk for days about the positivity around elective
Mhm.
cesareans and how we need to talk about that more specifically in the birth trauma community.
And I've also attended healing feedbacks, right?
Yep.
Because it's not about the method of delivery and it's not about the type of provider and it's not about the setting. So then, like, what is it about?
The way you're made to feel in your birth, which
Oh.
isn't always. So I always say my line is it's less about the mode of delivery and more about the way that you were made to feel, right?
Mm,
More about the way it was communicated and carried out.
hmm.
So when I say communicated and carried out, I don't always mean the fault or responsibility of the people in the room. Sometimes I
Hmm.
do. But in
Hmm.
my case, couldn't have been communicated or carried out any differently. But the way that it was carried out, being not alive when my child was born,
Mm.
was traumatizing, right? Like
Yeah.
that is the way it was carried out, even though it wasn't the fault of anyone.
Right. It doesn't have to be blame. It doesn't have to be finger
No.
pointing. It can just be a statement of what is.
Yes,
Yeah.
exactly. And so the way that we perceive that birth, and sometimes the word perceive feels icky, right?
Yeah.
Because
It
sometimes
kind
when
of
we,
feels like I'm sorry you perceive it that way, right?
yeah, like it feels like you chose to, like perception feels like a choice because we use it
Right.
like in such a manipulative sense, but it is the way that your nervous system perceives what is happening around you. And that
Hmm.
is not a choice, unfortunately.
Hmm.
We don't get a say in that.
Hmm.
And we all have different nervous systems. Bethany Warren has the best metaphor for this that I always use about nervous systems and boxes of crayons. I don't know if you've heard
Well,
about
let
this.
me hear it. No, tell me.
Okay, so she talks about how, I think she talked about this on my podcast when I had her on, but basically, like, we all get a nervous system when we're younger, right? It's formed, it's created by our environment, partly by, just genetics. And some people are handed like, that like amazing 64 pack of crayons that had like the sharpener
Mhm.
in the
Oh,
side and
yeah.
everyone wanted it
The
with all the different
smell.
shades. Oh, yes, yes,
Yes.
yes. Some children are handed that as their
Yeah.
nervous system to grow up with.
Yeah. Pristine.
Others, yes. Oh,
Hmm.
perfect.
High
Others are,
functioning.
yeah. Others are handed like the 8 pack fat primary color crayons.
Hmm.
Not a choice, right? We don't get a choice in that, unfortunately.
Hmm.
Um, the resilience aspect is we can always add to our pack, but someone walking into a birth experience with that 8 pack versus that
Hmm.
64 pack is a
Hmm.
very different experience. And there are different
Hmm.
internal resources to draw from that,
Right.
again, is not a choice of the patient. It's just
Right.
circumstances of their life.
Right. Yeah. And to add to that, it's the nervous system and it's also the surrounding context. Like
Of course.
how much validation,
Yep.
how much support do you have in your recovery? Like if you are doing it alone, if
Yep.
you are in an environment that's hostile, if
Mm-hmm.
you are being gaslighted and judged for what you're feeling, if
Yep.
you are being undernourished in your postpartum period, like all of those things contribute, right? Or
Yeah. Well, there's the
they contribute
mitigation.
positivity or they cause harm.
Right, because there's the
Yeah.
mitigation of trauma too. So if you are
Hmm.
in a situation where whatever happens, happens, right? We
Hmm.
are not saying that the perception of your nervous system is without the context of other people treating you poorly,
That's right. Yeah.
right? That is often something that is occurring, as we just talked about, the
Hmm.
majority that we see. But so if the event occurs, I'll use my
Hmm.
example. No one could have stopped it. It occurred. The after piece, right? There's so much mitigation that can happen that I think actually definitely related to, or I guess supported me in not developing full-blown PTSD.
Yeah.
So the
So
things that, go ahead.
So my question is, if I'm listening to us right now and I'm like, do I have it? Do I not have it? Like, how do I distinguish that I've got trauma versus I'm mad? I'm just mad at the treatment I received, or I'm grieving because I didn't get the postpartum that I was hoping for. Like, if I'm listening right now and what you and I are sharing is like sounding a little bit familiar, what are some of the things I might look for as like a marker that maybe trauma should be on my radar as a possibility?
Yeah. First, I always get curious about like why it matters. Like it does matter, but I do get a little bit curious about, I thought you were going to ask like the difference between PTSD and just experiencing trauma. And part of
Mm,
me was going to be like, duh, why is the reason that we care? Because you deserve treatment regardless. And I kind
right.
of feel that way about this too. Like you deserve treatment regardless of trying to figure out whether
Hmm.
exactly you were traumatized or not. But if we look at kind of symptomology,
Hmm. Well, I can answer that question because I think it might help. The
okay,
reason I like to parse it out is because my particular professional perspective on this is that right assessment begets correct treatment,
sure,
right? And there's so much overlap between like depression and trauma or anxiety and trauma and what exactly is
100%.
going on for me. And so to me, it's like if I'm just somebody listening to you and being like, oh, I don't know what am I experiencing right now? Like what would be your recommendation to them?
Well, that's where, so what you just described is what a clinician would do.
Right.
And a clinician who is appropriately trained in this, obviously. And so I
That's
would
the
want,
idea.
I know. So I'd want someone to be going to if they're like, I'm kind of concerned, I just don't know. I
Yeah.
want someone to be getting the support that they deserve, regardless of whether it's trauma or not.
Love that.
But to go
Yes.
back to your original question, because I do think it's important because we are information gatherers. I want to
Yeah.
know, right? Like,
Right.
as
Right.
someone who's sitting there, I want to know.
Yeah.
So I think the biggest factor for me is like kind of the intrusive nature of the
Hmm.
symptoms. And I think that kind of related to the memory of the experience, there's this overwhelm and this intrusive nature of recounting the birth, of recounting the experience around the
Right.
birth, whatever it
Yeah.
is, and rumination. I see
Hmm.
those a lot
Hmm.
when it
Where it
comes
feels like not voluntary.
exactly. It
Yeah.
continues to go back to that moment. Also, of course, when we see kind of, and I think sometimes this can be confused with anxiety, but we see the activation of that
Hmm.
nervous system. So you talk about this a lot, Krista, and I really like this because I think people don't recognize trauma because they're like, well, I'm not having flashbacks, right? They're
Hmm.
like, I'm not
Hmm.
like seeing the scene unfold in front of me as we see in like movies and TV with
Right.
PTSD. And so the idea of explaining somatic flashbacks, where you're not
Hmm.
necessarily seeing the scene in front of you,
Hmm.
but your nervous system reacts,
As
right,
if it's
to
repeat. Yep.
exactly as if it's
Hmm.
going into that fight or flight. So you're getting that increased heart rate, maybe you're getting the hyperarousal, or on the other end, the hypoarousal, that
Hmm.
dissociation, that disconnection. So I think sometimes recognizing how our body reacts to something, right, rather
Hmm.
than just the Hollywood flashbacks that we see.
Right. Yeah. Because in the movies, it's like you lose track of where you are in space and time. You like hit the floor and you duck and cover and
Yes,
like
which
you have
does
no idea
happen
where
for
you
some
are, which
people,
does happen, but
totally.
that's on the very severe end.
Yes.
And I think what's been very amazing about our work as a profession, I won't say like our work, but like the work of the profession in PTSD since about the 90s, from what I can see, is this recognition with people like Francine Shapiro and others of like that trauma is that the way trauma shows up can be a spectrum. And so it's really this is where I like to say like somatic time travel, which means like in your body. It's like your body time travels. So an example would be somebody who's like a traumatic car accident and they feel like they're leaving it behind them. And then they're, a few weeks later at the grocery store picking out produce. And then the music on the speaker is like the song that played before the
Yeah.
accident. And suddenly their heart is pounding. They feel dizzy. They feel nauseated. Their mouth is dry. Like they're like, oh, I'm like completely having a stress response. Well, if I went up and said, well, you're in the produce aisle, they'd go, yeah, I know.
Right.
Right? Like, yeah, I know. So an example of that too in postpartum is that I've seen this happen with people going to like the postpartum appointment and they're doing fine. And then they go like use the restroom and the smell of the soap is like the same soap
Every
used at the
time.
facility and
Every time.
boom, the
Yep.
soap, right? You know, the sound of a certain machine, the sound of the paper crinkling, like these sorts of things suddenly cause a stress response in you. And if I said like, well, you're not there, you're fine. You and your baby are fine. Everything's fine. You'd be like, yeah, I know.
Yeah.
But like, I'm not fine.
Yeah. It's that disconnect between like the cognitive brain, the
Mm-hmm.
knowing brain, and that felt
The
sense,
felt
that
senses.
amygdala part of the brain.
Yes, I love that. But I do love what you said about like, you deserve support regardless of what's going on. Right. So if like you're not okay, you're not okay.
Right. Whether it's mad,
Mm-hmm.
disappointed, trauma, having a place to process it with someone who knows what is going
Mm-hmm.
to help you, what we know
Yeah.
about evidence-based treatments, which
Yes.
is probably important to talk about too.
Yeah. You want to talk about it? Now's a great
Yeah,
time.
yeah. I mean, I think that for me, first of all, I want people to get into support. That's like that we just talked about. Regardless of what you're feeling, what you think it is, what you don't think it is, getting into support with someone who has training in, we always talk about both perinatal mental health and trauma.
Mm-hmm.
You and I think, disagree on the which one I prefer.
Yeah. We might.
Um, I don't know though. I go back and forth. I want
Yeah.
someone who's trained in trauma. What I have found with people who are trained in trauma and not trained in perinatal mental health or have no background at all in perinatal health, perinatal
Right.
mental health, is that they do the thing with the trauma where they're like, but your baby's fine.
Mm,
Everything's fine. You're fine. Like this isn't the trauma that I'm used to. And so anyway,
mm.
going off on a tangent, but I think that someone who is in perinatal mental health may also be able to get them eventually to someone who is trauma informed more so in that area than maybe the first person that they see. So if we're kind of
Yeah, this is
referring
so funny.
people
I think we do. We have an opposite take, and I think it's totally based on what we've seen.
exactly,
Because exactly what you're
exactly.
describing, I would say the other way around, where I've seen
I
people
know.
who have like certification in perinatal mental health who are more likely to go, it's anxiety or depression, because that's what I've been taught to see. And I haven't been taught to see postpartum trauma. And so let's use these techniques that are helpful for depression or anxiety,
Mm.
normally like cognitive confrontation or like change how you're thinking about it or
Stop
right
it.
these things. Stop
Stop
it.
it.
Yeah, stop doing that. Whereas
Stop
if you
doing
go to
that.
somebody, so this is what I always say, this is my caveat, like if you have to, if you can't find a perinatal specialist who specializes in trauma, because it's a bit of a unicorn for some people.
Unicorn. Totally in
Yeah,
some
which is
states.
why, like, I opened Nancy Perinatal. I know that you're looking to hire as well. Like, we are
Yeah,
on a mission to fix this, but
we
is a
are.
little bit of a unicorn for most of the US at this point.
Yep.
And so, if you have to pick, what I always say is like, I would rather a trauma expert who's trained in evidence supported trauma techniques, meaning something related to regulating your nervous system, not just going to have you talk about it, but going to
No,
help you regulate your nervous system. Pick one of those who will believe you that the birth is the cause of your trauma
that.
over going to a perinatal specialist who might have really good intentions for you, but doesn't have any nervous system tools under their belt because it's not a part of typical
You're
perinatal
right.
mental health training.
Yep.
But I think we're saying the same thing. And that's what
Kind of
matters,
are.
right? What we're saying is like, we get that you're having to patch together and cobble together a solution.
Yep.
You need to find a clinician who's going to believe you and respect you. A number one, regardless of what their background and training is, they need to believe you. And if they say to you, have you tried being grateful? Then just know that that is your sign. They did you a favor. That is your sign that
Bye
they are
bye.
not for you.
Bye bye.
And it's
Have you
not
tried
you, it's
writing in
them.
your gratitude journal?
Oh my
Listen,
God.
I love a good gratitude journal, but not for
It's
trauma.
not going to make the flashbacks go away. Like in the produce aisle,
No.
like I'm not going to sit there and say gratitude mantras and make
Oh my God.
the produce aisle better. Yeah. Yeah.
Yes. So
So find
yeah.
somebody who's going to believe you and who's going to respect your process, and find somebody who has a plan for regulating your nervous system. That
That.
is really key. Meaning, what we've learned, in the last few decades is that, and it's not, I'm just going to give you an insider, it's not getting taught in grad school widely yet. So,
It makes me so mad.
it makes
So
me so
mad.
mad too, because it's such an easy thing to teach. But I digress. We're working on it. We're working
We
on
are.
it,
We
Kayleigh.
are.
We're
We are.
working on it.
We are. We're getting there.
We're getting there. But the issue is that we think that we've been taught historically that we can sort of like talk you out of it, and that's just not accurate. You need to be able to regulate the nervous system in response to the memory.
Yes.
Right. So there are different methods of doing that. My favorite is EMDR or brain spotting.
Same.
Yeah. But there are others that have validation behind them. The
They do.
idea, though, is what we have learned is that to repeatedly talk about the experience without regulation of your nervous system happening at the same time actually causes harm.
Yes, it does.
You're just getting triggered over and over and over again. And how you know that that's the case is because, and I'm guilty of this in my early career because I didn't know this either. I wasn't taught this, where we'd have this amazing cathartic experience with a trauma survivor where they would like talk about it and have the breakthrough. Everyone felt good and they'd leave the office tired and like supported and exhausted. And I got it all out finally. And then 3 days later, the trigger arrives and they have the same dang response.
Yeah. And the amount of clients that I have that come to me, and again, this is not a judgment, anything like that. I'm earlier in my career, absolutely did the same things in other venues that I worked in. But the amount of times I've had birth trauma survivors come and say, like, I really like my therapist. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to keep seeing her, but I'm not getting any better.
Mm-hmm.
And it's because they're talking and talk. Like, I've talked about it, I've held space for it, I've validated my emotions,
I've
but
grieved.
it's not getting better.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm like, I know, because here, and like literally just explaining the psychoeducation
Mm-hmm.
education piece creates like so much validation and like pathway towards healing once we get into, again, that nervous system regulation with
Yeah.
I use EMDR. And so I think that's, yeah,
So
I
excited
think
that you
that's
use
key.
EMDR.
Oh, it's my
I love
favorite.
it. I
I
love it.
don't know how I existed without a plan for regulating,
Yeah.
right, the nervous
Yeah.
system
Yeah.
and with the memories that
Yeah.
come up.
Yeah.
Like it's just it's
Like every grad school trauma class should teach people how to do EMDR.
do you know that I had a psychodynamic trauma class in grad school? Which
Yeah.
again, for the conceptualization is interesting, but not for the actual practice.
Right. Yeah.
Um,
Interesting in concept, but again, we can circle around and around and around where you just keep getting triggered over and over again. And so it's it's so much suffering.
so much
Right?
suffering.
Like they're feeling lovingly supported and they love their therapist, but they're suffering. It's
Yeah.
affecting them in their life. And so I'm really excited about things like this, like that actually are providing relief from suffering. It feels
Yeah.
like really good as a clinician to be able to say, hey, actually, you don't have to suffer and we can do something about this.
Yeah.
So before we're done, like, I just want to take a moment to bring it back to like that listener that,
Mhm.
is maybe in the throes of like postpartum trauma, right? Maybe they're feeling it bothering their, it's impacting their relationship with their baby. It's impacting their relationship with their spouse. It's causing them to not want to get medical care. It's causing them to not sleep well at night. It's causing them to be jumpy and startled easily, or like whatever it is for them, how it's showing up for them. And they're just in the throes of it and they're listening to us right now. And like they've gotten some good tips and tools of how, like, here's some resources that we recommend, and I'll include more in the show notes. But I just want to hear your thoughts to that person in this moment who's like, am I ever going to be okay? Like, to that version of you that would like came home thinking they were just going to be great and off to bonding with baby. And now they're like hit with this. Like, what would you say to that person?
It won't always feel this awful. It won't. I think people are surprised when I promise that as a clinician,
Mm,
but I know it because I know from the evidence that we know how to treat trauma. Now, will your experience ever feel amazing? No. And I'm sorry
mm-hmm,
for that because that sucks. That grief that we have to
mm-hmm,
carry with us, that our experience will never be a joyous, beautiful one, is hard. And we live
mm-hmm,
with that for the rest of our lives. But that's very different than feeling overwhelmed and in an intolerable state.
mm-hmm,
That will not always feel that way. With a
mm-hmm.
with I always say with appropriate treatment and time, that does get better, but we need the treatment piece. But if you are sitting there listening and feeling Hopefully, I hope you're feeling less crazy. That's my one thing. Like, I want
Yes.
people who think that they're going crazy, that there's something
Hmm.
wrong with them, to
Hmm.
know that there is not, and that this is a normal reaction to an abnormal experience.
Right.
You are
That's
not
right.
crazy. You are not alone. And this will get better with treatment and time.
Oh, I love that. That's exactly where we're going to end for today. Thank you so much,
Of
Kaylee.
course.
If you're interested in seeing more of Kaylee's work, I will have all of that connected below. Thank you for the time you spent with us today and the passion that you infuse for this topic. The education piece that you bring to it is just so powerful, but most of all, the heart that you bring to it. So thank you for that.
Thank you, Krista. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for all of the beautiful work that you do. I always view you and the Bethany Warrens and the many others of the world as the people who were in the background, who were in academia, who were really the trailblazers of this, that allowed me to even have a Google search that showed up what birth trauma was, because that
Mm,
allowed me to speak so confidently about my experience. And without that, we just wouldn't be here so openly speaking on social media. So
I
a big
love
thank
that.
you to you.
We are just continuing to give better than we got, right?
So
And
true.
run the ball forward, and the next generation's going to take it from there, but we're going to give them better than what we got.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Thanks.